Picture yourself in the following situation. You are about to board one of the most modern airliners in the world for a holiday trip to Europe. It's the trip of your dreams, and you are just a few hours away from accomplishing it. However, in a matter of minutes, it can all turn into a nightmarish life or death situation. In this video, we'll be telling the story of the plane that ran out of fuel and made its pilots do the unthinkable to save everyone's lives. The 236 flight. This is the story of the infamous Air Transat Flight 236 on August 23, 2001. That evening, a total of 306 people, from which 239 were passengers and 13 were crew members, were boarding the Air Transat Airbus A330. It would take off from Pearson International Airport in Toronto, Canada, to arrive in Lisbon. The passengers consisted mostly of Canadians looking for a good time in European lands, or Portuguese nationals returning and paying their home country a visit. It was a peaceful and joyful atmosphere indeed, as the Airbus in which they would spend the following 7 hours was considered no less than a state-of-the-art aircraft. The A330 Airbus is a highly computerized and automated model filled with banks of computers connected to hundreds of sensors that are constantly monitoring the plane's operation. Such a system was enough to grant the A330 Airbus the reputation of being one of the safest aircrafts in the world. And with a 2-year-old aircraft being the one chosen to fly that night, it seemed that there was nothing the passengers, flight attendants, nor pilots had to be worried about. In fact, before takeoff, the pilots confirmed through the sensors that there wasn't any indicator of any major problem. Experienced 48-year-old Captain Robert Pichet and proficient 28-year-old First Officer Dirk de Jager were the ones commanding the 236 flight. Both had spotless training and performance records with the Air Transat, especially Piche, described by aviation specialist Yvan Miville-Deschênes as, quote, out of the ordinary, mainly for his 16,000 hours of flying experience in all kinds of aircraft and weather conditions. At 2:52 p.m., with the plane fully loaded with 47.9 metric tons of fuel, the aircraft took off. The weather that evening was fine, and for the first few hours, everything ran pretty smoothly, according to plan. There was one small exception, however. In order to avoid congestion, a small alteration to the route was made, and the plane headed 60 miles south from its original route. It was indeed a minor detail, but that would become crucial in the end. Inside the cabin, the passengers were all prepared to sleep and get some rest. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, there wasn't really much for the pilots to do, besides going over their crew's checklist. Their duties basically consisted of monitoring the plane systems, providing position reports to air traffic control, and every 30 minutes, checking the fuel quantity against the flight plan in order to keep track of fuel consumption. Things get complicated. All was well until the flight reached its 5-hour mark at around 5:16 a.m. As the aircraft was over the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, the pilots got their first warning signal, an unusual reading regarding engine number 2, located on the right-hand side of the plane. Under its right wing, the computer was signaling a high oil pressure but low oil quantity, plus a low oil temperature. These reports left Pichet and de Jager scratching their heads, since they had never seen such a combination. After all, oil temperatures don't fall, and a high oil pressure reading is very rare. Both went over the FCOM, the Flight Crew Operating Manual, and later contacted the Air Transat's Maintenance Center to find any possible explanations or instructions regarding these indicators. However, as their search came to nothing, all they could do was rely on themselves and keep monitoring the engine situation. Due to the nature of the readings, the pilots assumed that they were merely computer errors. However, only 20 minutes later, a new warning appeared on the computer display, indicating a fuel imbalance situation. The fuel is located in tanks, both on the left and right wings of the plane, and the computer was signaling that the fuel level on the right wing was significantly lower than the one on the left. This was again another unusual indication, but seemingly an easy one to solve. All the pilots had to do to fix it was to open a special cross-feed valve that allowed the fuel from the left wing to be transferred to the right wing. This cross-feed procedure is supposed to solve the situation quickly, but that didn't happen. Instead, the pilots received another series of warnings, which they continued to believe were computer errors. But when de Jager decided to make some calculations, he found out that apparently the fuel level was lowering much faster than its consumption. indicating a massive fuel leak. In addition to that, the instruments indicated that the total fuel on board had actually dropped below the level required to reach Lisbon. With this apparent fuel shortage, Captain Pichet was forced to deviate their route to the only option they had, the Lajes International Airport on the Azores Island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Accepting the truth. However, the pilots weren't buying this situation. In fact, they had more reasons to believe that this was indeed a computer error, rather than a real leak. After all, nothing had happened during the flight so far that could have caused the fuel to suddenly start leaking, such as turbulence or lightning strikes. Plus, the fuel consumption for the first hours was entirely normal, and all the checks up to that point were okay. So for the aircraft to suddenly have such a high level of fuel loss, more or less a ton every 5 minutes, just seemed unbelievable and inconceivable. It was way more likely that the fuel reading was erroneous. Besides, fuel leaks in passenger aircrafts are so rare that pilots are not actually trained on how to identify and deal with them during their training. All they have is a checklist in the case of a leak, but not much more than that. Pichet even requested a visual check by the flight attendant, but in the pitch-black dead of the night, it was impossible to notice the fuel leaking from the wings or engines. And I say so because we all know that the tragic truth is that there was indeed a major fuel leak on Flight 236. Pichet and de Jager continued to discuss as they realized that the situation was not improving. They considered starting the fuel leak procedure and announcing a fuel emergency when the truth finally hit them. Around 6:13 a.m., less than an hour after the first fuel alarm, the right-hand engine ran out of fuel and flamed out. With that, Pichet immediately applied full force on engine 1 on the left wing and started to descend from their 39,000 feet altitude. They were 240 kilometers away from the Lajes airport with only 600 kilograms of fuel left. That was when they finally realized that they weren't dealing with faulty data, but a true life or death situation. At last, de Jager declared an emergency to air traffic control. Up until this point, everything was calm and peaceful in the passenger's cabin, but this terrifying wake-up call put everyone on edge. For the first time, they realized that something was very wrong with their flight and stayed in complete but agonizing silence, hoping for the best. A matter of life and death. The crew only managed to rely on the remaining engine for the next 10 minutes. At 6:26 a.m., the left engine also shut down. While still 130 kilometers from Lajes, the Airbus A330 had no running engines. In a matter of minutes, one of the most sophisticated airliners of the modern era was now a giant glider headed for the ocean, or anything in front of it. Without engines, the plane also had no power or electrical system. All of the very small amount of energy and power the aircraft had was coming from a small propeller called ram air turbine, which generated limited electrical and hydraulic systems necessary to run the aircraft. With still 100 kilometers to go, at an altitude of 30,000 feet, the plane was descending at 2,000 feet per minute. In other words, the airplane would be down in 15 minutes.
Attempt a controlled landing on water.
And a forced landing on the water was not an option due to the minimum chances of survival. Still, the captain ordered the cabin to follow the standard emergency procedure for a water landing, causing panic among the passengers. If that wasn't enough, with no engines to feed air into the cabin, it was beginning to depressurize. As a result, the oxygen masks dropped for both passengers and crew to put on. Now, it was up to Captain Pichet to get himself and the other 305 souls out of that plane alive. The world's longest glider. With no power and during nighttime, the pilots were far from a comfortable situation, but still only had one chance at this landing, a chance that was solely possible due to the initial 60 miles south alteration in the original route. If it weren't for that, there would be no hope for the 306 people on board. They couldn't miss or overshoot it. The captain didn't have much control over the plane due to all the systems and devices being down, but this had to work. And as the Airbus A330 was descending to Lajes, the emergency services at the island were preparing themselves for a crash landing. But in the sky, the aircraft was still too high and too fast for the landing. To solve this, the captain began performing a series of advanced swerving maneuvers in order to slow the plane down. At the same time, he attempted 360-degree turns to try to gain some control over its altitude. Everything had to be calculated. Soon, the airplane neared the airport, and the crew and passengers got ready for the final approach. As passengers braced, the plane hit the runway hard, and at high speed, the impact was so big that 8 out of 12 tires burst, and the plane bounced before finally stopping in the middle of the runway. Although 18 passengers were injured due to the harsh landing, all 306 people on board were safe and quickly evacuated. If that wasn't too much of an emotional roller coaster for everyone involved already, Robert Pichet and Dirk de Jager earned the record for the longest glide of a passenger airliner ever, a title that they still hold. Plus, they were awarded with the Superior Airmanship Award by the Airline Pilots Association in recognition of their skill in executing a dead-stick landing of the Airbus A330 with no fatalities. At the time of the incident, both pilots were held by media and popular opinion as heroes, although they always claimed that they were only doing their jobs. It's true that the worst was way behind the crew and passengers. However, the story was far from over, as many questions were still unanswered. I mean, people still wanted to know, how could a highly sophisticated airliner suffer such a catastrophic failure? The aftermath. As investigation began immediately after the incident by the Portuguese, Canadian, and French transport authorities, they went on to examine the engine system to search for faults in the tanks and fuel lines, and it didn't really take long to find the source of the fuel leak. In the end, it all came down to a maintenance error on the right engine. 5 days before the flight, Air Transat sent the number 2 engine for maintenance and installed a replacement unit sent by Rolls-Royce. This new unit, however, didn't come with a hydraulic pump. To solve this, Transat mechanics used parts from an older engine that didn't fit properly. It was then only a matter of time before one of the pipes would break. After being pressed against one another for so long, it was later revealed that mechanics from Air Transat were aware of this error, but decided to go with the substitution because the other way round would cost too much. Shortly after that, the company accepted responsibility and paid a $250,000 fine. As for the pilots, investigators wanted to know what exactly happened and what more they could have done to prevent the crisis. The final verdict states that even though the Airbus's computer system was not in the best practical conditions and that there was a lack of proper training for this specific case, the pilots did fail to realize the fuel leak sooner, which contributed to the severity of the situation. However, investigators praised them for handling and solving the situation once the problem was identified and the engines shut down. After all, they did save 300 lives. After the incident, Airbus introduced a new warning to their computer system that checks all fuel levels and notifies pilots if there is a high rate of fuel loss that might indicate a leak. Meanwhile, Air Transat provided its pilots with additional training on extended range operations, fuel management, and diversions procedures. Let's just hope that all of these improvements will be enough to prevent another case, such as Flight 236. If you like this content, make sure to click on one of the cards on the screen to watch similar videos.